This is about a larger systemic change about the kind of system we operate in.
I believe that this is the moment that we need democracy more than ever.
We need more people of all types of backgrounds to step up and offer their expertise to solve the challenges in each of our communities.
Let's do what we know to be the right thing and be true to that inner voice. I didn't ask to be treated differently, but I'm going to take it on because I have a job to do and nothing's going to get in my way of doing that.
Go get yourself a political home. You know, Vote or Lead would love to be that home. Black Voters Matter would love to be that home for you.
Thank you for your support. Thank you for leading and running as you are. And I have your back.
We're so glad so many of you have decided to join us for your kitchen cabinet for the second week. And to kick off the second week, we have a Bomba dance performance by Miltree Tucker Concepcion. And she is the founder and CEO of the Bombaza Dance Company right here in New York City. And I'm just learning this, but Bomba is a style of dance and drum and music from Puerto Rico that celebrates its history, celebrates the history of resistance and the African slavery, and nowadays is a community expression of the Afro-Puerto Rican culture. So we're so happy to have you. Miltree, please take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Bomba.
Miltree, that was amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of that dance and what that was about?
Yes, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Erin and Paco, for having me. It's so amazing to have so many women leading, and as a leader myself in the community. Bomba dates back to the 17th century during the enslavement time in Puerto Rico. And we had them a lot in the haciendas, but also we have free people of color who were coming to the island seeking during the Spanish rule, seeking asylum and freedom. And as long as they pledged to the Spanish crown and also changed their religion, they were granted to be free. So it's a combination. So Bomba then became a form of resiliency, of freedom on Sundays and Saturdays afternoons. Why? Because during this time, there was news coming from out of Haiti of a revolution that was happening. So the Spanish at that time and the rulers at that time, what they did was that they imposed laws that would prevent the enslaved and free people of color to have anything that had to do with arms, and could we have another way of fighting another revolution. So what Bomba became then, it became kind of like a mask type of dance, kind of like similar to capoeira. So we would gather, my ancestors, right? Our ancestors would gather. On Sundays, they would sing. So bomba is song, dance, and drum. And what you just saw, because of the quarantine, I have a barril de bomba in the back. We do it in barrels of wine or wheat, not congas or djembe. That's the actual instrument of it. And I'm sorry, we're a little bit winded from dancing. But so they will gather to sing. The woman would sing with the maraca, which is a Taino Arawak instrument, as well as an African instrument. And the communication was what was going on in the hacienda, what was going on at that moment in the community. But some of the movements, some of the rhythms, right, served as a secret language to kind of like gather, to have these meetings to rebel in the island of Puerto Rico. Of course, powers that be, until now we have different types of scholars in the community, of Puerto Rican scholars who are unveiling these rebellions that happen in the island of Puerto Rico. Because for so many years, we were just told basically a sugar-coated form of what this was. So today, fast forward, fast forward now, we're free, but we have resisted because high society elites in Puerto Rico, in a lot of towns, actually banned drumming or dancing. And that was their form of way of kind of controlling this particular community. And so different families around the north, the south, for example, the Cepedas, the Ayalas in Santurce, the Albizu in Ponce from my hometown, they continue doing this amongst themselves. Now it became like a family type of, let's get together after work and every Saturday and Sunday. It's still like that, but now what we do have then is an outpour of thanks to organizations like mine and like yours and different organizations in what we call the diaspora here in the US that we continue to conserve. And that's where my mission comes. Wonderful. As a professor, as a dance educator, right, I preserve what this is because we need to conserve, right, what these different types of rhythms were. So we have 5 main rhythms. The rhythm that you just heard is called rhythm Sika. And it's a direct communication between dancer and drummer. So right now, all of you were my drummer. So I was dancing to you. And those were like sharp percussive movement. Different from, let's say, Afro-Cuban in Cuba, which had a larger concentration of enslavement there, enslaved people, that it's in rumba, it's like a simultaneous movement with the drum and dance. In Puerto Rico, in bomba, it's a direct communication. When I come in and I salute the drum, which is what I did, I saluted all of you, at that particular moment, I become the lead drummer. So the lead drummer must follow me. So I'm in control in that bate. So whatever I'm feeling is what it is expressed, but it has its own codified language. And that's what we do at Bombazo Dance Company, bombazo.org. We conserve that, but we also share the evolution. So as a dancer in a dance company, we fused it with contemporary modern dance, the African styles of other African styles of the Caribbean diaspora. We have 2 festivals a year. One that's showcasing how we're all united, how Puerto Rico is united to, let's say, St. Thomas, St. Croix, Cuba, Dominican Republic through Dance and Drum. That's the Bronx Dance and Drum Festival. And we also have the Bombazo in the Bronx, which is when the community gathers together students. And it's just one big family because this is from elders, multi-generational, from elders all the way to the little ones, learning and conserving this so that to make sure, because at one point it was almost extinct in Puerto Rico. So that's why these families were very important, that they were able to continue to record. And with that being said, I wrote the first Bomba children's book, right? So all the information is on our website, bombazodanceco.com. This is a bilingual children's book. It's a great resource. And I have to leave a little bit early, but if you have any questions about the history or more information about the work that I do here in the Bronx, and we also travel once this all has passed us and we can travel safely. If you would like to hold conversations or movement workshops, I'm more than happy to. I'm actually going to do that one now in Mexico. So thank you so much for having me. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email or to go to our website, bombazodance.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miltree.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great conversation. Thank you for your leadership.
Thanks. And what I love about that dance is that it really has its roots in resistance. And that's going to be something that we're going to be talking about today. So good morning to our friends on the West Coast. Good afternoon to our friends in the Midwest and the East Coast. My name is Paku Hang, and I'm the Chief Program Officer with Vote Run Lead. Thank you for joining us for season 2 of our Kitchen Cabinet series. We're calling season 2 of this Kitchen Cabinet series, Radical Leaders, Uncovering the Path to Build a Democracy We All Deserve. And in this season, we will examine the origins and ideas that birthed our democracy in the United States and how those ideas still reverberate today. This is a 6-part series that began last week with a question, where did we come from? And for the next hour, we will examine how did we get here, or I'm sorry, how did we begin? This is an important question because how did our democracy begin? And if you go to the next slide, how did our democracy begin starts with the Declaration of Independence and the words of Thomas Jefferson, who we know enslaved over 600 people throughout the course of his life. During the time of the Revolutionary period, if you go to the next slide, half of the 2.5 million people living in the colonies, I think we have a, if you can go to the previous slide, half of the 2.5 million people living in the 13 colonies were enslaved. So when they heard or read the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, what did that mean to them? And what does that mean for us nowadays? How do we reconcile the ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution with the realities that how we began and prospered as a country was on the backs of enslaved Black people? You can go to the next slide. So for the next hour, we are going to hear from 4 speakers who will talk about slavery in the time of the Revolutionary War, slavery in the Constitution, enslaved Black women, and early American democracy and what it means. Then we will pivot and draw a connection between the Black patriots in the Revolutionary War with the immigrants or children of immigrants, patriots in modern time. More specifically, we must ask ourselves, what is the obligation of a grateful nation to the American patriots who are treated like second-class citizens or are not even citizens at all? Go to the next slide.
I want to just go back to the slide on the trigger warning. You know, we are going to be having, this week's topic is extremely important. It's also full of sorrow and heartbreak, as Miltree, you know, expressed to us both in the joy of dance and the reasons behind some of the sort of covert language that's built into it. Some of the content may be harmful, it may be offensive, it may be traumatizing, and so we want you to prioritize your well-being, right? You feel free to go off camera, feel free to do some breathing exercise, feel free to put some emotions in the chat if you want to share it. We're trying to create sort of a really respectful culture during these. You all have been wonderful, so we ask everyone to stay muted. And because we have a really rich, you saw a sneak peek of the cabinet members, we have rich expertise on today's session. We're actually going to ask you to send questions through the chat. We're not going to be doing our breakout rooms with smaller groups. So your questions for the speakers, put them through the chat. Our team is tracking them, and we'll make sure that those questions get asked after every speaker. We want to, you know, we commit to keep the flow going and being respectful of your time in the next hour. And then last but not least, we've been calling this the season of inquiry. To describe the journey we're on and the grace that we're giving to ourselves and to others as we seek to learn and to listen. Because we know that when we know better, we do better. And then if you have, you know, with that in mind, if you have resources, so many of you shared resources in last week's Kitchen Cabinet, we are creating that living document of resources. You can send it to info@voterunlead.org. You can drop a link in the Slack. And again, our team will pull together those resources that we've started, and they'll be available on our website. So 4 amazing speakers this morning, 4 cabinet members who are here for you to share their knowledge with you and to take your questions as you're on your own leadership journey. And our first speaker is Manisha Sinha, the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She's the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina. That was named one of the 10 best books on slavery and Politico in 2015. She was featured in the New York Times 1619 Project. And her second book is a multiple award winning, it's The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. It was also listed for a National Book Award for nonfiction. And she's also one of the mentors of one of our other speakers. So we are thrilled to have her join us today. And if you have any questions for Manisha, again, please put them in the chat box. Take it away, Manisha.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that introduction. And thank you, Paku, and your team for putting together this wonderful program. I'm going to go very fast since I don't have that much time and we have many interesting speakers here. But I will begin by just saying that enslaved people always resisted their enslavement. And it was interesting to hear Milteri talk about the origins of her dance form, because a lot of enslaved people from South Carolina and Georgia actually went to St. Augustine in Florida. They escaped there to win their freedom, and they converted to Catholicism, and they resisted re-enslavement for a long time, right up to the 1812 war. So enslaved people were resisting their enslavement by running away, slave rebellions, but also by using the law as an instrument for liberation. They sued for their freedom, they petitioned for their freedom. And if we go to the next slide, I will talk about one of the most important law cases, the Somerset case of 1772, in which an enslaved man by the name of James Somerset, who was taken by his American enslaver to Britain, actually sued for his freedom. And the British court, Lord Mansfield, decided that his colonial master could not actually re-enslave him or take him back to the colonies. This is a very important case, the Somerset case, because it is probably at the foundation of anti-slavery jurisprudence in the Revolutionary era. And it is only fitting that it is named after an enslaved person. He solicited the help of Granville Sharp, an abolitionist lawyer, a pioneering British abolitionist, who is pictured here. And the Somerset principle became a principle that abolitionist lawyers would use in the northern free states to free slaves being brought over to the northern states by slaveholders. So it is very important in terms of legal precedent. Now, some people have argued that Southern slaveholders, some of them, decided to join the Patriot cause because they thought Britain was moving towards abolition. But other slaveholders saw the natural rights philosophy of the Revolutionary War as a threat to slavery, and they became Tories or loyalists. So you could go anywhere if you were a slaveholder. Next slide, please. Even if you were an enslaved person, you could fight for your freedom on both sides. And it's really important for us, I think, to recover the history of Black military service in the war for independence. African Americans did something that was very important, which was they tried to join the fight for independence in order to claim citizenship in the new republic and to fight for their own freedom and to fight for the end of slavery in general. Now, it is a common tenet, a common proposition of revolutionary republicanism that if you perform service, the duties of citizenship, like fighting for your country, you are entitled to the rights and privileges of citizenship. So this became a way to demand equal citizenship. It was, of course, a very masculinist discourse, that this was only men. You know, women, if they fought under disguise. But if you look at Tammy Duckworth and her recent claim to patriotism based on her military service, it shows you that this idea, of course, now transcends gender. Now, we know around 5,000 to 6,000 African Americans fought in the Continental Navy and Army. We know that one of the first martyrs of the revolution in the Boston Massacre was an Afro-Indian sailor and runaway slave, Crispus Attucks. They fought in Bunker Hill, in Lexington, in Concord. But even when the Revolutionary War really got way, it was the British who first appealed to the enslaved to join them. You had Lord Dunmore's proclamation. He asked enslaved people to join him. If they did, they would get their freedom, you know, they would get their freedom and that of their families too. Dunmore was the British governor of Virginia. Now, Washington, when he took charge of the Continental Army, he initially banned African Americans from serving in the army. He was a Virginian slaveholder. He would only later on become this kind of cosmopolitan revolutionary leader. But after Dunmore's proclamation, both Washington and the Continental Congress allowed African Americans to serve in the army, and ultimately even the enslaved did so, sometimes as substitutes for their masters, but sometimes they just volunteered. Now, the Daughters of the American Revolution have been keeping a track of how many African Americans and Native Americans served in the Revolutionary Army. And we know it was between 5,000 to 6,000, but that number keeps going up as they find more and more of them. We also know that one of the old enslaved regiments from Rhode Island played a crucial role in the last battle of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown. We also know that a lot more African Americans served with the British, around 10,000, the so-called Black Loyalists. Now, why did that happen? Well, many southern states were very resistant to having free African Americans and enslaved people serve in the Revolutionary Army. And this is especially true in South Carolina and Georgia that rejected plans by Washington and by the Continental Congress to recruit African Americans. So if they wanted to fight for their freedom, the only possibility was, in fact, to fight on the British side. These Black loyalists ultimately left the United States. Many of them were fleeing the founding fathers. They were slaves of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. They went to Canada, ultimately to the British colony of Sierra Leone in Africa. And interestingly enough, they had imbibed many of those revolutionary ideas, because in Sierra Leone, George Washington's slave, Harry Washington, led a rebellion against British colonial authorities. So if you look at the scope of Black military service and its impact in the long term, it was quite important. Now, next slide, please. Of course, African Americans fought for their freedom in many other ways too. They, as I said, sued for their freedom. And Black women, particularly just before the war, beginning in the 1760s, sort of outnumber men when it comes to suing for their freedom. One of the most important was Mom Bet Elizabeth Freeman, and I won't talk too much about her because Nika will tell you about her story in detail. But it is her freedom suit and that of a fellow slave, Quogue Walker, that goes right up to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court that ends up abolishing slavery in Massachusetts. So here we can see abolition coming from the actions of the enslaved themselves. Black women petitioned, they wrote, for also Phyllis Wheatley, who's not just one of the first American women, not one of the first Black women to be published, she's one of the first American women to be published. Her book of poems was published in London in 1773. It attracted the attention of Granville Sharp and Benjamin Franklin. She wrote an ode to Washington, and he replied rather respectfully to her. So these were important ways in which African Americans were claiming citizenship in the new American Republic through their writings, through fighting against slavery. Another important person at this time is Olaudah Equiano, pictured here on the right, who joins the movement to abolish slave trade. And one of the fallouts of the revolution is, in fact, the abolition of the African slave trade by the British and by the American government, as written in the Constitution that Andrew Delbanco will tell you more about. But what's important to remember is that the American Revolution resulted in the first large-scale emancipation in the Western Hemisphere. All the northern states passed gradual emancipation laws that freed adult African Americans. And it's important to remember that this move first happened as a fallout from the American Revolution. Next slide, please. We also have the start of the first abolition movement. This was called the Society for the Relief of Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, that became the famous Pennsylvania Abolition Society that was headed by Benjamin Franklin. That picture there is a kind of a romanticized 19th century depiction of it, but again, it shows the role of women. It shows Dinah Neville, an Afro-Indian woman who was enslaved with her 4 children. And this society was formed specifically to help her out. She was enslaved in New Jersey and she was being sent to the South. And they fought many such cases. And the Quakers especially were very prominent in it. We had outstanding Quaker abolitionists in the colonial era. They led the abolition movement, and in their own society, they made slaveholding illegal before the rest of the country. So if you go to the next slide, you will see that there was another revolution that Military referred to that was very important in the age of revolutions besides the American and the French Revolution, and that was the Haitian Revolution. It is the only instance of a successful slave rebellion in world history, and it led to the foundation of the first modern Black republic. And now African Americans and abolitionists looked to it for inspiration, but most slaveholders actually dreaded it, and they did not want this kind of revolution occurring in their own countries. But it was a point of great inspiration, especially to Black abolitionists. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about the Black abolitionists in the early American Republic who fought against slavery. Most of them did this by rejecting this program of colonization, which was this program to just colonize all free Blacks back to Africa, so that the only people left in America would be Black slaves and white citizens, no free Blacks. Free Blacks rejected that in the North, and they started getting very involved in the abolition movement too. The man in the middle, Richard Allen, and on the right, Absalom Jones, were the founders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Black abolitionist church that was attacked in Charleston by Dylann Roof in 2015. So you see the connections between the struggle for Black equality from that time to our times. Those institutions and those struggles remain. And then lastly, I will mention James Horton on the left, who was actually captured by the British in a man of war, but refused to give up his allegiance to the American Republic. He eventually becomes a very important abolitionist who bankrolls the new abolition movement of the 19th century to fight against slavery in the South. Because though the North gets rid of slavery, in the South, slavery is an expansive institution. It spreads, it becomes stronger both politically and economically. And James Horton was one of those people who really supported the rise of a new abolition movement to get rid of slavery completely. And I leave you with that, with the idea that what the revolution gave birth to was not just a fight for against slavery, it was also a fight for Black citizenship in this country. And that's important to remember, because African Americans have always fought to reimagine democracy and citizenship in the United States. And I think it's something that all of us as scholars, as activists, as political leaders can learn from. Thank you.
Manisha, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Manisha, thank you so much. That was so amazing. Like, clearly slavery or the threatened abolition was looming in the minds of these, founding fathers during the revolutionary period. Something that really struck me about what you said was this idea that enslaved people have always resisted their enslavement, right? Whether through the legal realms or whether in their minds and their ideas. And in the next chapter, that's so powerful. Folks, our beloved community, if you have any questions for Manisha, please type them in the chat box and Erin will select a question and then ask. And in the meantime, if you could, in the chat box, if you could type one word that would describe your reaction to what Manisha was saying. Such powerful words. Erin, do we have a question for Manisha?
We do. We have a question from May, and it's just a sort of asking Manisha for you to comment on Nikole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project, on her suggestion that the war was fought in part to maintain slavery in the new republic.
So as I said earlier, there certainly were Southern slaveholders who were very wary of the Somerset decision, and they were seeing it as an anti-slavery move. But of course, the British Empire was not attacking slavery. It was a slaveholding empire. It was the most prominent slave trading power in the world at that time. They hadn't yet even abolished the slave trade. So in a way, yes, there may have been some people who joined the Patriot cause for that, but that's not the only cause. I would say there were many patriots who were uncomfortable with slavery, particularly most of the Northern founding fathers like Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who would then lend the prestige of their names to abolition societies. This is also true, of course, of other lesser-known revolutionary figures who joined the abolition movement, who were not just anti-slavery in sentiment, like Jefferson, or who didn't just free their slaves. And this is important. Washington did. He was the only Southern founding father who actually freed his slaves when he died. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, even knowing that he had been a slaveholder pretty much all through his life. And Black abolitionists reacted to that. You know, they differentiated between people. They said, oh, we don't like Jefferson because he's kind of saying racist things, even though he wrote the Declaration of Independence. We kind of like Washington because at least in his last act as the father of the nation, he freed his slaves. So I viewed a lot of these people through the eyes of contemporary African Americans. And I can certainly say that there were enough anti-slavery streams also at that time, and many of the founders writing against slavery, like James Otis's pamphlet and many others that I talk about in my book. So it's a complicated historical event, and people went into it for all kinds of reasons. So I won't dispute Nicole Hannah-Jones' claim that maybe some of them actually did join it in order to protect slave property. But soon there would be a fight between ideas of liberty and property. Is the slave's right to liberty or the slaveholder's right to property? And you can see that unfolding in the North with these gradual emancipation laws that freed only children of slaves, and after they reach adulthood, they try to kind of compromise and balance those competing ideas.
Thank you. We have just a clarifying question. Elizabeth is asking around Washington, did he free his slaves in name only as his, they became the property of his wife? Is that a truth or a myth? Or yeah.
Well, it is a kind of a, because what he did in his will was, because his wife actually was very against this idea, and he kind of hides this from her through much of his idea to free his slaves in his will. The will says that all his slaves would be free after the death of his wife. But his wife is so terrified that they will kill her in order to get their freedom. The slaveholders knew, even when they talked about faithful slaves, what enslaved people were capable of to win their freedom, that she freed them immediately. She didn't want to live, keeping them in slavery. So he did. There was a caveat that they would be free only after her death. So it didn't free them immediately after his death. So that's a good question.
Manisha, I just want to say really quickly that the ideas that you talk about are really complex, and they force us to see historians as complex people too, right? But I'm also upset because these are not the stories that we heard or that we learned in our history classes growing up. So, sorry, Erin. Thank you.
Great. And I want to thank you, Manisha. I want to introduce our second speaker, Andrew Delbanco. Andrew, we rarely have male speakers. I apologize. He is the Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia. He's the author of the book, The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. It's a New York Times notable book. He was awarded the Ennisfield Wolf Prize, the Lionel Trilling Award, the Mark Layton History Prize. And we're so excited about the book, actually, that we're going to be giving it away to the first 15 people who fill out the survey after this call. So, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll get our sound figured out. And also, if you have questions for Andrew in the same way, please put them in the chat box. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Paku, very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of this conversation and to follow my friend Manisha, who packed a lot of interesting insights into a few minutes. So I'm not going to try to rival that, but let me try to speak fairly quickly so that I won't overshoot my time. First of all, sounds a little conventional to say it, but I hope you won't take it that way. I'm very glad to meet you all virtually. I wish we could meet in person. We're all struggling with this reality of this pandemic, and I admire tremendously the commitment that you all represent to working through this and making this a better society. We've been reminded by this pandemic of the horrific inequities in our society as the virus has affected communities of color with particular virulence. And I think we should all note that and try to make sure that our fellow citizens are aware of it as well. I want to start by remarking on a comment that a lot of people are quoting these days from the writer William Faulkner, who says, and you've all heard this, that history, that the past is not only not dead, it isn't even past. Now, in the course of my own work on the book that's just been mentioned about the experience of fugitive slaves in the history of our republic and even before the founding of the republic. I personally, I have to say, I hope you'll indulge me and let me say that, I came to understand this point in a deeper way than I think I had before. And in particular, I think one can say that Black Americans have always known this. They've known it perhaps better than white Americans. Let me make that point a little more concrete. Any Black person in the period that Manisha was just speaking about and before and after, any Black person who was running or even walking fast was assumed to be a criminal. And the crime, particularly young Black males, but not exclusively young Black males, and the crime of which that person was assumed to be guilty was the crime of having stolen himself, which is a concept that I try to encourage my students to wrap their minds around. The idea that slavery meant, among the many other things it meant, that you did not own yourself, that by making the attempt to find freedom, you were stealing property that belonged to somebody else. Now, I don't think I have to belabor the point to suggest that we have been reminded in recent times, the Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia, before that, Trayvon Martin case, many other tragic cases that could be cited, that in 21st century America, this is still too often true. That Black people are assumed to be criminals if they are behaving on the street in a way that white people feel they should not be doing. So the Faulkner's point is not something that Black people need to be educated about. It's white people, I think, who need to be educated about it. Now, I've been asked to speak about slavery and its relationship to the Constitution. The short response to that assignment is to say that slavery is all over the United States Constitution. It permeates the United States Constitution, which is, as Paco just alluded to a moment ago, not something that many of us learned in school when we were taught to revere the Constitution as the bulwark of our freedoms, and end of story. Now, in what way does it permeate the Constitution? There are three places in particular in the Constitution where slavery is directly alluded to. The first is the notorious 3/5 clause, which states that and I don't have it open in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, that 3/5 of all other persons shall be counted for the purpose of representation in the House of Representatives. I'll get back to that in a moment. I'll just note for the moment that the word slave or slavery does not appear in that clause. Indeed, it does not appear anywhere in the US Constitution. So something weird is going on there, a document which is in many ways directly supportive of the institution of slavery, but never names it. And historians are still debating about why that's so. Were the founding fathers embarrassed by this fact? Did they want to evade it? Did they want to keep the word out of the Constitution because they believed that the nation would evolve to the point where the institution of slavery would no longer be part of the body politic? Those are complicated questions, and I'm not going to try to answer them now, but the fact is slavery is there, but the word slavery is not there. Now, a second point in the Constitution where slavery is referred to directly is in the so-called migration or importation clause, which states that Congress shall pass no law, Congress shall not prohibit the migration or importation of such persons as any given state may wish to bring in for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution 1787. What's being stated here, of course, is that the slave states that are interested in importing more slave labor will be free from federal constraint to do so for at least another 20 years. Again, the word slave and slavery does not appear there. And the third place in the Constitution where slavery is alluded to directly is in the also notorious Fugitive Slave clause, where it is stated, and again I paraphrase, that no person owing service or labor in one state can escape that obligation by going to another state, but must be returned to the party to whom service or labor is due. That's the focal point of the book I wrote. That's the beginning of a very long struggle over the fate of those enslaved persons who sought to escape slavery. And it's a complicated story that leads up to the Civil War, and that, in my view, the resistance of Black enslaved people and of their white allies in what I call somewhere in the book the first Black Lives Matter movement, the first biracial, multiracial resistance movement in the history of our country, I think had more to do with the coming of the Civil War than we might have previously acknowledged. So, slavery is all over the Constitution, and we could take the view that the old view that the Constitution is a sacred document that all Americans should revere and embrace should be supplanted by, replaced by a new view, which is that the Constitution is not a document to which we owe any respect because it was the bulwark of the institution of slavery. As you can probably tell from the way I put that, I am inclined, and every person will have a different view of this, to take a somewhat a more, I don't know if middling position is the right view or nuanced position, but a more complex position. Complex in the way that Manisha answered the question about Nicole Hannah-Jones's view of the revolution, that the revolution was not a pro-slavery revolution or an anti-slavery revolution, but that it had elements of both. And that's what I would say, something along those same lines about the Constitution. Now, let me try to illustrate just a couple of the complications that I have in mind. And I would say, just as an aside, that what I say to my students when I talk with them about our literature or our history is that I'm in the confusion business. I think confusion can be a good thing when it means that we look at a problem and as a multidimensional problem rather than as a singular one. And if I may say so, and I don't mean to preach or sermonize to those of you who are embarking on lives of public service, I think we could use a little more confusion in this sense in our politics and a little less clarity. That is, a little more willingness to talk about the complications that face us as a society, even if we are fully committed to progressive politics. So, confusion. So first of all, the 3/5 clause is often understood, that is misunderstood, as meaning that slave owners believed, and the signers of the Constitution believed, that enslaved Black people were worth only 3/5 of a full white human being. That is not the implication or the meaning of the 3/5 clause. In fact, it would have been in the interest of Southern slave owners if slaves had been counted as full persons for the purpose of representation, because then they would have had more representatives and more political power in the federal government. So this was an odious compromise, I think it's fair to say, but the confusion is that Southerners would have preferred it to be whole persons and Northerners would have preferred it to be not to have enslaved Black people not counted at all. So that's one point. Now the importation migration clause. Yes, we can read it as a sort of evasion and cop-out and sidestepping of the issue by the Constitutional Convention and telling Congress that it couldn't do anything about the slave trade for 20 years. And we would be right to say that. But then you find no less an authority than the great African-American historian W.E.B. Du Bois, who in his landmark book on the suppression of the slave trade says, most, if not all, of the representatives to the Constitutional Convention believed that by setting the stage for congressional prohibition of the slave trade 20 years hence, they were taking the first step toward the eradication of slavery itself. That is, most of the representatives to the Constitutional Convention probably believed that slavery was an institution on the way out. Turned out they were wrong. They did not anticipate the growing economic significance of slavery the rise of technologies that made the cultivation of cotton even more profitable and even more important than it had been before cotton and tobacco. So they were wrong, but the context in which they made this, this clause about importation of other persons is one that Du Bois believed was fundamentally an anti-slavery context. So that's a complicating point in terms of our relationship with the Constitution. And finally, the Fugitive Slave Clause itself, which is a long story, attaches to that, which I won't try to tell, and I've probably almost already gone over my time, but I want to make just one fundamental point. The very idea that the United States Constitution could protect the rights of slave owners to retrieve their human property is a shocking, odious, morally indefensible position that we should be astounded and appalled is in our Constitution. And I have been quite struck since I wrote this book, and people write to me about it or talk to me about it, how many well-educated and sophisticated people do not know that such a clause is in the United States Constitution. So if nothing else, it's worth our just making sure that people know that. Now, the ratification of the Constitution, including that clause, which by the way is still in the Constitution, because since it doesn't use the word slavery, it is in the Constitution, and it refers to the idea that someone duly convicted in one state or accused of a crime in one state cannot escape the legal process by going to another state. And we might have differing opinions about the value of that application of the clause, but there it is, still in the Constitution. But the historical question that it raises, and I think, if I may say so, it raises a question for all of you who are embarking on lives of public service, and particularly in politics, is, are there occasions when one should acknowledge the moral indefensibility of a given position held by your opponents and nevertheless make a deal with them? Because that's what happened in the ratification of the Constitution. We don't know, because it's one of those what if questions. We don't know what would have happened if Northern delegates, and there were many Northern delegates who had deep reservations about the Fugitive Slave Clause and thought it was outrageous. We don't know what would have happened if they had refused to sign on to a constitution that included that clause. It's quite plausible there would have been no ratification, and therefore there would have been no American Republic. Now, would that have been a good thing or a bad thing for the cause of emancipation and human freedom? We don't know the answer to that either. But what we do know is that Northerners who, as Manisha said, were from states that were en route to the abolition of slavery by the 1780s, decided that they would sign on despite the presence of that clause and the others that I've mentioned, and there are other ways in which the Constitution defended the interests of slaveholders as well. I don't know the answer to that question. It's a moral question, it's a philosophical question, it's a personal question and a political question. Under what circumstances do you say, I will not have anything to do with this and walk away? And under what circumstances do you say, let's try to find some areas where we can agree? And my position, my hope is that as we move along through the political process, the thing that you believe in and that I hate will go away. We'll have a less chance of flourishing in the world because of the political deal that we're making now.
Right, right.
That's the question I would leave you with. I don't have an answer to it, but I do think it's an important question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And you're absolutely right. That is a really important question for all leaders, whether they're public or leaders in their homes, to think about. When do we compromise and when do we hold fast? Erin, do we have any questions for Andrew in our chat box?
Folks are also asking for Andrew and others' recommendations on the sort of the origins, if you will, almost of the slave trade. Why Black people? Where did this come from? You know, what are some of before it sort of landed on America? Right.
Well,
There are two books that I would recommend in that regard. The first is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, and the other one that I would suggest is Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams.
yes, I was going to mention
Can I
Eric.
ask you to put those in the chat? Is that possible? Okay, because I didn't type fast enough. All right. Andrew?
No, I was going to mention the Eric Williams book. It's a tremendously complex question, and you know, we know that the slave trade dates back many centuries, long before the Declaration and the Constitution, and that cultures and societies of all kinds were involved in it, and that Africans participated in the slave trade. You know, I'm not sure what to say about it, except it's an odious fact of human history that some people have enslaved other people since the beginning of time. And it's actually a remarkable fact that in the 18th century, the enslavement of other human beings came to be perceived, for some of the reasons that Manisha has alluded to, as morally indefensible, inconsistent with political principles of individual rights, with religious conviction, and all the rest. And it's a dramatic and ultimately hopeful story that we are capable of eradicating evils that have been around for a long time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. And, you know, I just want to reiterate Andrew's final question to all of us is, you know, when is the time to compromise, to seek some type of accomplishment to what you're working on, or when is the time to hold fast to those values? And that is the question, I think, of great leaders. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you to all of you who are participating in the chat. You know, we just want to check in and make sure that you are, you know, taking care of yourself, taking a breath. The recording will be fully available. The slides will be fully available. So if this gets to be too much, it is okay to take a break or to step out. You will have access to all of this and to the speakers. I want to introduce our third speaker, Nika Denny, Dr. Nika Denny. She's an assistant professor. Excuse me. She's an assistant professor of history at Washington and Lee University. She's a Black feminist scholar. Her specializations are in 19th and 20th century Black women's intellectual thought. She earned her PhD in African American Studies from UMass Amherst. She completed her BA in Political Science with honors in Africana Studies at Williams College. She is also the co-founder and president of the Black Women's Studies Association, and her first monograph is called Redefining Radicalism: The Rise of Black Feminism and the Politics of Respectability in the 19th Century, and it is under contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press. Please welcome Dr. Denny.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am very happy to join you today. My name is Nika Denny, and I'm a historian of Black women's feminism. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Vote Run Lead for inviting me to participate in this panel today. What I'd like to do is connect some dots to help us think through what happens after the Revolutionary War and what this means for Black women. As my co-panelists have already established, there were many contradictions between the existence of slavery on one hand and the founding of a free republic on the other. During the 1700s, drawing on Enlightenment-era philosophers like John Locke, some Americans saw the right to own property as a necessary component of freedom. If property rights were central to liberty, however, so too was slavery, since it was a major form of property ownership during the 18th century. This means that freedom for some was predicated on the enslavement of others. This paradox had particular implications for Black women, who were essential to sustaining slavery in the United States through their reproductive abilities. Slaveholders profited from enslaved women having children, since it meant that they could own more slaves without having to purchase them. Therefore, there was a premium placed on enslaved women's fertility. Black women were valuable in part because they were expected to perform reproductive labor by having more children. As such, there was perhaps no population more acutely acquainted with the contradictions of our country's founding ideals than enslaved Black women. Despite their exclusion from the American body politic, Black women consistently found ways to leave their mark. The question that I'd like for us to explore together is, how did Black women give meaning to American democracy in the wake of the American Revolution? Through 2 brief case studies, I'll show how Black women simultaneously exposed fractures in the country's democratic system and worked to mend them. Next slide, please. We'll first consider the case of Mum Bet, which Manisha Sinha, who is also my graduate school mentor and dissertation chair, mentioned earlier. Mum Bet was an enslaved woman who was born in New York around 1744, and in her youth, she was given to her former owner's daughter and new husband, Colonel John Ashley of Massachusetts. While many people generally associate slavery with the South, it's important to note that slavery existed in all 13 colonies. It ended slightly earlier in some northern colonies and states, in part because of freedom suits like the one brought by Mum Bet. Freedom suits are exactly what they sound like. Some enslaved people secured their freedom by suing their masters for it. Historical accounts indicate that Mum Bet, who eventually renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman, overheard John Ashley discussing the recently ratified Massachusetts state constitution with an attorney, Thomas Sedgwick. The portion
We may have just lost Nika.
of the Constitution in question stated and property. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, just repeat the last 15 seconds.
Sure. One of the things that I had mentioned is that freedom suits are somewhat self-explanatory in that there are enslaved people who secured their freedom by suing their masters for it. Historical accounts indicate that Mum Bet, who eventually renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman, overheard John Ashley discussing the recently ratified state constitution of Massachusetts with an attorney, Thomas Sedgwick. The portion of the Constitution in question stated, quote, "Mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other, and have a right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives, their liberty, and property," end quote. So again, we see how this idea of property ownership factors into colonial ideas about what people should naturally have a right to in a democracy. Mum Bet understood the state constitution to be incompatible with slavery, allegedly stating, quote, "I heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are created equal and that every man has a right to freedom. I'm not a dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom?" End quote. Despite her enslavement and her inability to read or write, she understood that the state constitution held the promise of universal freedom, and she understood that the legal system had the potential to guarantee that the law was applied equally. Mum Bet and another enslaved man, Brom, worked with Sedgwick to sue for their freedom. A jury decided the case in their favor. This case offered a legal precedent for a similar suit 2 years later in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Dennison, which Manisha alluded to earlier. The decision in this case effectively deemed slavery unconstitutional, as Chief Justice William Cushing wrote, quote, "All men are born free and equal. Every subject is entitled to liberty and to have it guarded by the laws, as well as life and property, and in short, is totally repugnant to the idea of being born slaves. This being the case, I think the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and constitution, and there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature." As a brief side note, though, the remainder of that goes on to offer language that's similar to what we see in the 13th Amendment, which says that slavery is unconstitutional, except in the cases where folks have been duly convicted, as Andrew mentioned previously. So I just want to point out that this duly convicted language, or the notion that there's an exception about forced labor in case you are deemed a criminal, is something that we don't only see in the 13th Amendment, but we also see it elsewhere, and we see it a bit earlier. The case of Mum Bet shows that regardless of their social position, class status, or education, Black women have always been acutely aware of the theoretical limitations and possibilities of American democracy. Next slide, please. We turn now to Maria Stewart, who was born free in Hartford, Connecticut in 1803. After being orphaned at a young age, Stewart worked as a domestic servant. In Boston in 1831, She became the first African-American woman public speaker and the first woman speaker ever to lecture before an interracial and co-ed audience in the United States. The spirit of the American Revolution lived on in her work, and she frequently used it to advocate for the abolition of slavery. Maria Stewart's abolitionist speeches and writings often centered the plight of enslaved Black women. For example, in her 1831 pamphlet, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the Sure Foundation on Which We Must Build, she asked, quote, "How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles?" End quote. During the 19th century, African-American women were often considered unwomanly and indelicate because of their race. Stewart challenged this notion by referring to them as the fair daughters of Africa, and she advocated for a broader conception of their social and economic roles, and indeed the basis of their enslavement, by suggesting that Black women's fairness was at odds with their labor. Stewart emphasized Black women's femininity in order to advance abolition. In her writings and speeches, Stewart occasionally directed her commentary towards Black women because she was cognizant that they were uniquely positioned within the US socio-political landscape. The aforementioned pamphlet posited, quote, "Do you ask the disposition I would have you possess? Possess the spirit of independence. The Americans do, and why should not you? Possess the spirit of men, bold and enterprising, fearless and undaunted. Sue for your rights and privileges. Know the reason that you cannot attain them. Weary them with your importunities. You can but die if you make the attempt, and we shall certainly die if you do not." End quote. Stewart did not hold political office, nor could she exercise the right to vote. Nevertheless, she put forth a vision of American democracy that could truly guarantee liberty and justice for all. Next slide, please. I'd like for us to circle back to our opening question. How did Black women give meaning to American democracy in the wake of the American Revolution? They accomplished this task in three important ways. First, they identified its limitations. As we see with Mum Bet, she saw the inherent contradiction between Americans claiming to value and protect freedom while enslaving African Americans. Second, they sought avenues to participate in democracy despite their exclusion from the body politic. Maria Stewart shows how Black women capitalized on alternative forms of mobilization in the face of opposition to ensure that their voices were still heard. Third, Black women like Mum Bet and Maria Stewart demanded that American democracy live up to its radical potential. They embraced the country's promises of freedom, understood what American democracy can offer if only we let it, and have continually held the country's feet to the fire to ensure that it becomes the best that it can be. The legacies of Mum Bet and Maria Stewart have lived on in the examples of other Black women pictured here, such as Black suffragists who marched despite facing racism from white women activists, Fannie Lou Hamer, who represented the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and insisted on speaking at the 1964 DNC convention, Shirley Chisholm, the first Black congresswoman and first woman to run for president, Kamala Harris, a notable senator and former Democratic presidential candidate, and Stacey Abrams, who did not step away from politics after losing the Georgia governor's race in 2018, but instead has led nationwide campaigns against voter suppression. If we accept the premise that critique is the highest form of patriotism, then Black women are necessarily the fiercest patriots this nation has ever known. Thank you.
Nika, thank you so much. I feel like your point is that Black women have been instrumental in shaping American democracy, right? And I feel like especially this year, I keep hearing over and over that, you know, Black women are gonna save democracy. But your presentation tells us like Black women have been saving democracy since the very beginning.
Pretty much.
That was so inspirational. Thank you so much. Erin, do we have any questions for Nika from the chat box?
We do. We have a question if Maria Stewart considered herself an American.
That's a good question. I would say that yes, she considered herself an American, but she wanted to be able to experience the rights and privileges of American citizens because those are rights and privileges that had been denied to African Americans for so long. So when she says, do this because this is what the Americans do, she's not suggesting that she herself is not American, but rather she's identifying how American actually means white American in the context that it was being deployed in during the 19th century, and with how general ideas about citizenship were racially exclusive.
Right. So I want to thank Nika, that was amazing. And I also want to thank Andrew and Manisha for your wisdom and sharing that wisdom with us. You know, each of those previous speakers spoke about slavery in the time of Revolutionary War, but also questions of citizenship and patriotism. And Manisha already told us a little bit about how by the 1777, 10 to 15% of George Washington's army was made up of actually Black soldiers. And when I was learning about this, I kept wondering, like, why would these Black soldiers sign up to fight in a cause that clearly was not going to give them those rights? And it's a question that a lot of folks have actually looked into. And I was really intrigued by this attorney in Minneapolis. She wrote this thing that I thought was really interesting. She said, Blacks have been in America since 1619 as enslaved people, but even as free men, they were barely given, they were barely able to raise themselves above the economic conditions of slaves. The army, right, George Washington's army, was a vehicle for them to find steady, dignified labor, as been the case for many marginalized people in this country. And it made me think about how, like, does that apply nowadays, right? And without diminishing the really noble decisions that I think many people have to risk their lives and to fight for this country, the truth of the matter is that many immigrants or children of immigrants, many minorities, often enlist in the military because the military allows them to access resources that otherwise they wouldn't have, right? Resources like to get an education, resources like jobs training, even for some, resources like a pathway to citizenship. And so our next speaker is going to talk and connect the kind of ethos of Black patriotism during the Revolutionary War with American patriotism now, especially among immigrants and children of immigrants.
Great. Is that my cue?
Erin, do you want to introduce Felicia?
Sure, let me give you a proper introduction. Felicia is currently the Director of Immigration at the Beacon Fund, but she's here in her more personal capacity and as an expert, of course. Also, we must share one of Paku's old college roommates, and so you should have heard the glee when Paku connected back with you, Felicia. From 2009 to 2017, she served as White House Domestic Policy Counsel, where she developed and advanced President Obama's immigration legislation and administrative agenda, including immigration reform and the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. She led the White House Task Force on New Americans. She's a San Antonio native. She earned her Bachelor of Arts from Yale, a Master's in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and her JD from UCLA Law School. And we are so happy she could join us because she has actually just given birth to her newborn son only a few months ago. We are so happy to have you, and thank you today for joining us, Felicia.
Thanks so much. Hopefully you all can hear me, and I know we're a little bit over time, so I will try to be as brief as possible. And happy to answer questions. So, you know, Paku and her team asked me to talk a little bit about immigrants' service in the military over the last few centuries, and particularly also about legislation called the Enlist Act. So I will do that, and like I said, happy to answer questions. So before I go into what the Enlist Act is, which is current pending legislation, I wanted to talk a little bit about immigrants, a long history of service in the military. If you could go to the next slide. I have a couple of stats that I wanted to flag for folks. You know, the immigrants have been serving have been providing service to our military and armed forces since the Revolutionary War. You think about the Marquis de Lafayette coming to the U.S. From France and taking up arms with George Washington and others. There were many, many more individuals who served in the Revolutionary War, and so much so that by the 1840s, in the lead up to the Civil War, the foreign-born represented just about half of military recruits. At that point, many of them were German and Irish immigrants, and 20% of them were in the Union Army. Over the last century, you think about World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and more recently, the last 20 years, immigrants have represented about 760,000 service members. Next slide. So just in terms of today's military presence of immigrants, I include immigrants who are foreign born, but also their children, because I think that is an important thing to talk about. As Paku mentioned, many people join the military because it is a way to move up the economic ladder because of the benefits that veterans have and are receive. And then also, you know, young children, US born children of immigrants also grow up hearing about from their parents who, you know, made the ultimate sacrifice to come here, about the importance of giving back to their country. And that's something that's not always talked about. You know, in today's climate, you know, we hear a lot about immigrants as takers, as folks that are doing damage to our country in a variety of ways. And we know that that's really not the case. 2.4 million veterans are in our country right now who are either immigrant origin, 500,000 who are foreign born themselves, including 40,000 who are actively serving, and then almost 1.9 million veterans of US born, who are US born children of immigrants. About 700,000 legal permanent residents, these are green card holders, enlist annually. And over the last 20 years, about 100,000 of those folks have earned their citizenship through mechanisms that are in place under the law. Next slide. So just talking at the same time that people are enlisting, one other factoid I would point out is that about 20% of all Congressional Medal of Honor recipients were immigrants. It's a stat that John McCain used to use a lot when he would talk about you know, his commitment to immigration reform as you know, as something that's a bipartisan issue, and talking about the commitments and the sacrifices that immigrants have made in service to our country. But at the same time, there's a record of injustices that have been inflicted upon immigrants, their children, and other family members. So some immigrants who have served when they returned back from World War II were subject to Jim Crow segregation, just in the same way that African Americans were. So in South Texas, a young man by the name of Felix Longoria died and eventually received the Congressional Medal of Honor. And when he was trying to be buried in a you know, facility and have a funeral service, he was denied that ability by you know, a funeral service company who did not want to have Mexicans use their facilities. That spurred the creation of the American GI Forum, which is an organization committed to Mexican American veterans. And the person who founded the GI Forum, Dr. Hector Flores, actually made a very big public stink about this issue of Felix Longoria being denied funeral services. He wrote to the president at the time, LBJ, who ended up having the young man buried in Arlington Cemetery. So it was the kind of beginning of the American GI Forum. In addition, there have been Filipino World War II veterans who were actually living in the Philippines and were called to serve during the war. And were promised that if they served, they would get access to naturalization and other benefits, as many people, close to a couple 100,000 people, were naturalized during World War II who served. But unfortunately, these Filipino veterans were denied that benefit in the end. And for many decades, members of Congress fought to actually restore those benefits to them and to their offspring, to their children and grandchildren. And then, of course, we had concentration camps, internment camps during World War II that housed and imprisoned Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants. At the same time, Japanese the children of Japanese immigrants were serving in World War II. So this is just an example. These are just some of the examples of the past and even today We know that many non-citizen veterans have been subject to deportation, and even U.S. citizens who marry foreign-born individuals who maybe these individuals are serving in the military, these U.S. citizens, but they have a wife or a spouse or child who is foreign-born, a parent, and those individuals can be deported under current law right now. Next slide. So who can actually enlist in the U.S. Army and the U.S. Armed Forces? So they're amongst the foreign-born. So people who have naturalized, people who are green card holders, nationals of countries from some of the freely associated states, the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. And during peacetime, non-citizens are eligible to naturalize after 1 year of military service. But during wartime, there is statutory authority for the president to authorize expedited military naturalization. And this is something that actually President Bush put in place in 2002 during the war, the war on terrorism. Something that continued under the Obama administration, and something that has actually been curtailed during this current administration. But basically, the way it used to work was that an individual could enlist and then naturalize. It was called the basic training program. Basically, you enlist, and by the end of basic training, you would be able to be sworn in as a citizen before you actually, before you actually saw combat or did anything in the service arena. And additionally, there are ways for additional categories of people, maybe students who come here, people who hold other kinds of immigration visa statuses, to enlist through a program called the MAVNI program, which again was a program that was created by the Bush administration, continued into the Obama administration, and now severely curtailed by the Trump administration. The MAVNI program as it existed allowed people who had special language skills and special categories of skills that were in high demand in the military to enlist. So this was something that about 10,000 people took advantage of over the last several years. Next slide. So that brings us to what the Enlist Act is. You notice from the list that I provided just in the last slide is that if you're undocumented, you're not allowed to enlist in the military. What the Enlist Act does, it's bipartisan legislation. It was introduced in 2017. The lead sponsor, when it was first introduced, was a Republican, and then now the lead sponsor is actually a Democrat in the House of Representatives. It would grant lawful permanent resident status, so green card status, to undocumented immigrants who were brought to the country as children and who want to enlist in the U.S. Armed Forces. And so there are requirements that must be met under this proposed legislation. But it basically provides a pathway for dreamers, for DACA recipients who grew up in this country and consider it home and want to serve, to be able to be given that opportunity. I can remember when we were fighting for legislative action in the Obama administration, and even before that, when I served in the United States Senate as a staffer, that there were these young people who maybe were in the ROTC in high school, and just like their friends who wanted to go to college, found out that they had barriers because of their status as they were getting older. These young people who wanted to enlist in the military found out that they had barriers because they were not allowed under the law to enlist. And so that's what the Enlist Act seeks to do. So the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. So I would just say that the Enlist Act is one way to provide a pathway to citizenship and status for Dreamers and DACA recipients, but really it's a very limited path, and it doesn't honor the contributions, the various contributions that immigrants are making to our country who are undocumented. They're working every day. They're of all ages. They're all over our country. They're in our essential workforce, the healthcare workforce, in the fields, picking the harvests that we are all eating at our dinner tables. And there should be a variety of ways that are much more robust and that would allow as many of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in our country a pathway to citizenship. With respect to dreamers or DACA recipients, young people who came to the U.S. as children, the DREAM Act is a much more robust piece of legislation. When you think of the history of the Enlist Act, as I mentioned, it was first introduced by a Republican member of Congress and is more limited, probably because of his own politics. But the DREAM Act is a process that allows people to get that pathway to citizenship if they join the military, if they pursue higher education, if they work in if they've worked in our country in some form or capacity. The other thing that we have to think about is the deportations of immigrants, not just immigrant veterans, not just thinking about legalizing them, but what comes next. Because until they become citizens, fully U.S. citizens, they are subject to deportation under our current laws. And there are incidents and many veterans who have been deported over the years. People who maybe served in the military came back. Actually, a number of Vietnam veterans who came back with trauma, PTSD before we knew what it was, right? And maybe got in trouble with the law. And then 10, 20 years down the line, they were picked up and they were deported after serving our country and making a life here. And maybe they don't even know the country they're heading back to and the language of that country. And so that's something that's been reported about quite a bit. There's a kind of a colony, I would say, of veterans that are in Tijuana, Mexico, who have been the subject of deportation and are trying to find a way to either get back to the U.S. Or by the commutation of their former crimes that actually subjected them to deportation, or the changes in our immigration laws. And if they can't get back here, also trying to better their lives by getting counseling, support, and work training. But that is a laudable effort on the other side of the border, but these folks shouldn't be deported at all, if at all possible. So I don't know if I had another slide that just talks a little bit about just a variety of different links here from organizations that have really lifted up the history of immigrant veterans, lifting up the history of lifting up the actions that are happening right now against immigrants who are in the military, or trying to curtail that option for immigrants to enter the military, and also talking about other pieces of legislation that are broader and that would help more individuals earn that pathway to citizenship. And I will stop there. I'm happy to answer questions. And as you said, Paku, it's an honorable thing for a person who's not from our country to be to feel so compelled and feel so patriotic when they come here to become a part of our country. At the same time, this shouldn't be the only way people can actually earn their citizenship and be kind of given the right to really call themselves fully American. It's a bit of a contrast that these folks are so patriotic and then yet get treated as less than American probably for their whole lives, and hopefully not for the lives of the second or third generation of their children. But it does happen, and I think we're seeing the consequences of that right now in this moment we're living in, when those young people, when those next generation are not really feeling and being treated fully to be a part of our country.
I think you're so right, Felicia. I feel like we started this conversation, right, talking about abolition, and we don't often use the word abolition to talk about our undocumented brothers and sisters in this country, but that's really what this is a movement of abolition, of liberation. And we started this conversation talking about these historical matters, and yet, like you just showed, it's still applicable today, that these issues still reverberate today. So thank you so much for sharing us that history, and unfortunately that real sadness. But you're right, the DREAM Act is a more comprehensive approach to real liberation. So thank you. Erin, do we have any questions for Felicia from the chat box?
We do. We have one question on is there a legal argument to counter Trump's recent assertion that non-citizens are not entitled to congressional representation?
I think there are numerous legal arguments, and I'm certain that smarter lawyers than me are going to be arguing, making that case through litigation in the coming months. You know, in the last couple of years, as you all probably recall, the Trump administration was trying to, you know, to not have to prevent individuals or deter individuals from who are immigrants from actually filling out the census by asking a question about citizenship. And you know, the goal, what they're doing now, this executive order, this executive pronouncement, is really what all of that question, what that question was all about. Right. You know, right? And the Supreme Court stopped them from actually getting that question included. Frankly, the damage had already been done, because for a year or so, everyone was hearing about this question, and there's still a lot of confusion about whether it's in the census or not, and it created a ton of fear, in addition to all the other bad things that have been happening that have created fear amongst the immigrant community. And so, yeah, I'm not an expert in voting rights in that part of the Constitution, but I know that I've heard from conversations that I've had with others who are, that there will be a robust legal strategy to push back on this this latest action.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicia.
So I want to thank all of our speakers. I know you can't hear us, the sort of uneventful, if you will, sort of climax, but I want you to know that for the women that have stayed on, which has been a majority of us, and those that have to scoot, we are very grateful for your time. We are very grateful for your expertise. And I want to share with the women who are on the Zoom call that the reason so many of these brilliant scholars and leaders have come on is because they want you to know what they're sharing as you take it into your public leadership, as you take it into your public service. But I also want to recognize that this has been a lot, and I want to just give us an opportunity to take a breath collectively, to sort of breathe in compassion for ourselves, breathe in a little bit of love for ourselves and for some of the feelings that we're having, and I want you to breathe out a little of that fear and anxiety. So we're going to do that twice. I like to do a 5 count, so in for 5, out for 5. Thank you. We will officially be making these 90 minutes. We are going to make that change. This is, we want to make sure that we want to give you that opportunity to connect with the speakers. We have, you know, this is week 2. We have 4 more weeks.